So, I want to start off by talking about the fundamental assumptions of the sociology of education. That should take about 2 minutes. And then I want to talk about the basis of the European modernization project, and that's really the focus that I shall be looking at, because we hear a lot about this modernization project, and we don't hear very much about what it is. It is as if it's necessary only to announce it for its meaning to be clear, which is totally wrong. And then I may try to look at how they're related to each other. And please do feel free to stop me at any point and say, what do you mean? I'm quite used to people saying, what are you talking about? Yeah. Okay. The assumptions of the sociology of education. This was in part, this was because I did this presentation yesterday in France. And the sociology of education in France is totally different from the sociology of education in the UK. The sociology of education in France, they refer to as government science. It is working with the government to improve and purify, in a sense, French education. And that is the major difference between them. That is the contextual difference between them. Because in the UK, sociology of education certainly was, and still is, quite self-consciously critical. It's almost that you can't do sociology of education in the UK without being something that's called critical. Unfortunately, that frequently descends into criticism and worse, into sort of name-calling of the whatever government happens to be in power. But it's a very different approach. And the other point that distinguishes them, and that I think these three elements together, location, context, and project, are what essentially define and shape sociology of education in different countries. And by location, I mean where it is practiced. And here again, there's a big difference in the French and UK situation. And I don't know, I mean, I'd be very interested to hear how these things work here. But in the UK, the location of the sociology of education is essentially in institutions that train teachers. And this has a big effect on the sociology of education in England. But in my view, it does. It means there is a kind of, just as the French sociology of education has this tacit relationship, more than tacit relationship with the government, so UK sociology of education has something of a similar relationship with the teaching profession. And so one of the things that you will find absent pretty much from UK sociology of education, for instance, is very much criticism of teachers. Teachers are okay. School managers may not be okay, and the government may not be okay, but teachers on the whole are okay. And the other thing, the thing that they do have in common, is what I refer to as the project, what they think they're doing it for. And in both cases, it's a quasi-religious project. I call it for the UK a redemptive project. And it is the recognition, and it's quite an arrogant recognition, I suppose, but it's one that it's good that somebody has it, that says education is the institution through which the promises of modernity will be delivered. Education itself is is an institution of modernity, and it is the institution that will deliver the promises of modernity, in particular individualization, but most of all the possibility of severing and weakening the link between social origins and destinations, the means of ensuring that you don't end up doing what your father or mother did. And this is its big project. It is a big liberatory project that it tries to hang on through thick and thin. So those three things drive it and set the shape for sociology of education. And then I think we need to look at its domain assumptions. This is a term taken from the American sociologist Alvin Gouldner, who says that all disciplines, in a sense, start off with pre-theoretical assumptions. We can't explain them. They are essentially, I suppose, forms of a priori. They are pre-theoretical assumptions. And for sociology of education, these are around the assumptions of modernity, as I said, but also with conceptions of a contribution to a social contract of education that is built up of combinations of three elements. One is, and by social contract, what I mean essentially is, why should the collectivity, the population, the public, why should they pay for it? Why should they pay for education? What can we say they get in return? What do they get in return? Three things, I think, are promised implicitly. One is that education will enable us to become better people. And the way to create a better society is by creating better people. The second way is that education offers the possibility, as I said, of social mobility, of a greater range of choices, larger and better range of choices. And thirdly, it offers the possibility of contributing to economic growth through knowledge, creating better economies that benefit everybody. So there are three different ways, not necessarily mutually exclusive ways, through which this social contract might be elaborated. Do you mind if I stop and take my sweater off? It's getting a bit hot out here. We get to, so we've done the sociology of sociology, we've done its domain assumptions. And the third thing we need to know is its meta-theoretical assumptions. How it goes about understanding, in what terms it understands the world. And I think that it has been characterized by three, what I, and Susan Robertson, who works with me on this, call isms. There are three crucial isms: methodological nationalism, methodological statism, and methodological educationism. Methodological nationalism is an approach that is not confined to sociology of education at all, but is common, really, is a basic assumption of most social science. And it is, because we are used to living in nation states, then there is a tendency to equate society with nation state, to see the nation state as the container of society. And when we're explaining society, it's an assumed national society that we are explaining. And I want to say that now is no longer tenable. We cannot understand what's going on if we think that what goes on within any nation state is confined to events, institutions, and so on that are found in those nation states. Methodological nationalism is seriously misleading. Methodological statism is somewhat similar. Methodological statism is the set of assumptions that we always have a state, but that the state, in a sense, always takes the same forms, that it does the same things. It looks at law, it looks at resources, etc. And it operates through, in essentially the same ways. It operates in state-like ways, and it operates over the same kind of terrain. It's interested in the same objects. And frequently we take as the model for this state the post-war social democratic state of Northwest Europe, where the state, in a sense, has a job of domesticating capitalism at a national level through Keynesian economic theories, through a conception of the welfare state, and so on. And we tend to take that as the default position, the default version of what a state is. That also is quite misleading, because the range of forms and meanings and understandings of the state are very varied. We might just, if we just look at, for instance, there are very, very different forms of the capitalist state. But not all states in the world are capitalist states. There are, for instance, what are referred to as rentier states, resource-based states, where essentially there is no relationship between the economy, the population, and the polity, because the whole thing is based on the extraction of raw materials. The raw material curse, the oil curse, where we see the call for inverting the idea of no taxation without representation. In rentier states, it's the opposite. It should be no representation without taxation. And so that link between the populace and the rulers is absent. And the other form of the state that I think is really interesting now, is especially interesting now, is the way I've come to think of seeing the Chinese state. We're all somewhat bewildered and baffled by how China can have private institutions, private universities, and still call itself a socialist state. The difference, the way that this happens, I think, is caught very well by Giovanni Arrighi. And Arrighi says the difference between China and the capitalist state, and the reason that China can do this is that in China, the same classes do not control the economy and the polity as they do in capitalist states. That's almost a definition of capitalist states. And China has a severance there. The party is independent of the economy, and the economy does not influence the party. Now, if we go around thinking that the Northwestern European capitalist state of the Trente Glorieuses following the Second World War is the model, then again we mislead ourselves. And I talked about institutional fetishism earlier today, but institutional fetishism identifies particular ideas with the forms they take. So that it's as if there's only one set of forms that we can possibly call democracy. And we tend to fall into that because we say, we say it's sufficient to have elections, to have democracy. And that is clearly a somewhat limiting assumption. Anyway, those are the background assumptions of sociology of education. And that is my throat is just about cleared. Having done that, I can get on and do something more. Okay, so how do we go about then? What's the background towards interpreting the European project? Again, I want to go a long, long way back and say that essentially all the kind of turbulences and shifts that we are experiencing at present can be traced fundamentally to the changing relationships between capitalism and Western modernity. These are historically linked together, but only contingently so, not necessarily so. And I want to argue along with, and this is based on the work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, that with a neoliberal phase of capitalism, the trajectories of capitalism and modernity may be separating. They are certainly under strain. As the institutions of modernity, which have served as the frame for capitalism over these years, cease to be as effective a frame for it as they were before, and they become, in a sense, obsolescent. And among those things, among those institutions, is education. And I think, though it's never, of course, put in these terms, that the second phase of the Lisbon Agenda, following the midterm review, actually is a kind of recognition of it, and it is that problem, the relationship between economic and political institutions, including education, that is put under strain by this new phase. There. Now, Ulrich Beck and colleagues see a similar separation, not an identical separation, but a similar one. And this is very important for the argument I want to make here. They see a distinction between the principles of modernity and its practices and institutions. They say the principles are retained, but the institutions and practices are a little bit shaky around it. They are not adequately related to the principles. They're not updating the principles. And the core of the argument I'm making here is that we can see this distinction, these two distinctions, if you like, between capitalism and modernity, and the obsolescence of the institutions of modernity as a basis for capitalism, as is what used to be referred to. I think it was Lenin, Pavel, no, they called it the best possible shell. Capitalism is the best possible shell. Democracy is the best possible shell for capitalism. That is eroding. And I think that we can see echoes of that in the relationship between the European level of education and the member state level. And I think that is crucial to the understanding of that relationship. And the argument fundamentally is that the European level is, in a sense, the repository of the principles of modernity that have to be maintained in this new phase of capitalism. And the member states level is where the institutions and practices are taking place that are found wanting. Because we see this is a fairly pragmatic kind of comparison made, because essentially that there isn't very much more at the European level than a set of principles, and there isn't very much less at the nation-state level, at the member state level, than the set of institutions and practices. So there, I think that's the basis of what I'm going to say, that the European modernization project is a project to, as it were, modernize the principles of modernity in a particular new phase of capitalism. And that's the fundamental argument. So, as it says at the bottom, modernization here means making the principles of Western modernity compatible with global capitalism as the frame for the practices and institutions of modern states. At the national level, we see national levels, national architectures of education. What are education, not education systems, because that already narrows it too much. What is the education activity made up of? I want to say it's made up of four things. It's made up, first of all, of responding to the core problems of capitalism, which is the fundamental purpose of the state. Capitalism is unable, from its own resources and through its own logic, to overcome a set of core problems that it creates. It's unable to overcome the problem of accumulation because it can't stop. It's like a dog that can't stop eating. It can't, from its own resources, produce the level of social cohesion that is necessary for the accumulation of capital. And it can't, from its own resources, produce the legitimation of a fundamentally unequal system that is necessary for it to perpetuate itself. So states have these core problems of capitalism. States are the basis of the solution of these core problems, and education is very heavily involved in all of those. It's not all that education does, but education is heavily involved in solving all those three problems. The other things that education are involved in are that the way it does this, because this is how it developed, at least in Western modernity, this is how it developed. It developed through those discourses and practices of modernity that talked about progress. They talked about science. They talked about the possibility of understanding the world, the social world, just as we understand the natural world, in order to control and exploit it, and so on. And those are the ways that the core problems were solved fundamentally. Together, these provided something that we can recognize as the grammar of schooling. Education in this conception is reduced to schooling. It becomes schooling. And it becomes schooling built on a particular pattern. It becomes schooling built on a particular temporal pattern of the year, which has now come, having reflected the needs of wider society in the original formulation of the academic year. The academic year now itself shapes the other activities of society through school holidays, the length of the school day, and so on. And a whole lot of things happen within schooling that happen because they happen. One teacher, 30 kids, classrooms, lockstep curriculum, and so on, all make up this grammar of schooling, along with a number of other activities that become part of schooling, that become accreted to schooling, all that fundamentally have nothing to do with schooling. I can best illustrate this by an example from a school in Bristol, which was invested very, very heavily in information technology, to the point where one year the then principal said that as an experiment, for one day, the whole of year 9 in the school will not come to school, but will do lessons at home on their keyboards. And what this very simple experiment, he didn't expect this. It exposed an awful lot about the grammar of schooling. First of all, the immediate response was from parents who said, "What the hell is going on? we do not send kids to school for you to send them home again. We have got to find a babysitter. We've got to find somebody to look after them. That's your job. In essence, they're saying, that's a job that's got nothing to do, of course, with education necessarily. The teachers hated it. The teachers hated it because they had to make explicit everything that they do implicitly. Instead of just looking at somebody in a particular way, they somehow or other had to write out that instruction, which is very difficult. And they had to keep on following all these kids separately instead of collectively. So they hated it. And the kids hated it. The kids hated it because they go to school to meet their friends, not to do classes. And if they're prevented from meeting their friends, they're unhappy. But the funniest thing of all, I think, in this experiment was what the kids did, because they had all these problems to do, and they had to do them in particular temporal order, like a normal school day would be. But instead of nudging the person next to them and saying, "What have you got for number 7?" what do you think they did?
Search internet.
No, they didn't. They did it cooperatively.
Facebook or anything.
They texted each other and said, "What have you got for number 7?" It was just the same. Now, what does that tells us so much about the things we take for granted about schooling, and about these things that have nothing to do with education, but have just been accreted, and we cannot imagine being separated from education. Okay, the fourth thing that it does is it's national. This doesn't mean that any analysis that looks at this from a national perspective is necessarily methodologically nationalist, because the national is really important. It is the place that the nation defines and reproduces itself. And that remains a very important part of schooling. So we've got those four things in kind of the schooling of the schooling model of modernity. But if we look at now at the European model of school modernization, and the European model of school modernization is trying to, in a sense, identify and define and implement the new expectations of current capitalism, then we find something like this. So the first part is what those two papers and the overhead and the PowerPoint that I was going to talk about are about. So you can find all that out there. So European education models are shaped formally by its treaty responsibilities and substantively by the Lisbon Agenda and the European social model, and they're carried out through the open method of social of coordination. They're brought into being by the open method of coordination, which provides the means of constructing European unity on the one hand and national diversity on the other hand. But the benchmarks for education and training are not concrete targets for individual countries, but reference levels for a European average. What OMC involves then, and this is a nice way, I think, in part, of looking at the relationship between the two scales, is put well by Klaus Offer. It involves unlearning and partial demolition of nationally entrenched institutional patterns. The first thing is to say your way isn't the only way. Excuse me, nor necessarily the best way. And that brings home to member states' political elites the need for modernization. Modernization and recalibration of the hitherto adopted social policies. Now, Offer wrote that, I think, in 1992, which was quite an early time. No, he didn't. He couldn't have. In 2002, maybe. What the point is, what what he referred to as modernization there is not what is referred to as modernization now, which I want to go on and have a look at. Anyway, what this framework, this opportunity structure, if you like, results in is a restricted scope for Europe in education. It can't do everything, and indeed it doesn't want to do everything. Europe, the European level, does not want to replicate national systems in every detail at all. It wants to do some of the things that national systems do, but not all of them. And because of that restricted scope, and because of the way that Europe can work, because it can only work through the treaty and so on, there's a tendency for it to concentrate on what Peter Hall calls policy paradigms rather than policies. And by policy paradigms, he sort of means big ideas, not little policy shifts, but a whole new policy idea that would change things. It produces a focus on program ontologies rather than programs. Program ontologies, because again, the EU can't introduce programs. Education programs are the prerogative of member states. It can, though, focus more through the open method of coordination, for instance, on program ontologies. That is, how do programs work rather than programs themselves. So the example I gave when I mentioned that this morning is the example for program ontologies is the example of smoking cures. Now, the person who did this concentrates heavily on evaluating social programs. And what he says is when you're evaluating programs, you're not evaluating the content of the program, but you're evaluating what he calls the logic of the program, or the program ontology. The best example, as I say, comes from smoking cures, because he says you can't possibly compare smoking cures as different as hypnosis, health threats, nicotine patches, hypnosis, and so on. You can't compare those because they have a different logic. What you can do is compare the logics, not the programs. And that, I think, is a way of looking at the European take on national education programs. And the open method of coordination becomes a basis of competitive comparison. We have a common basis and we do peer review and so on. They are thus decoupled from the sphere of politics, from the sphere of national politics in particular, and they are directed at national education systems, changing the system, rather than national education policies, because that is not allowed under the treaty. So, if we look then at the forms and status of the European project, as it is currently, I think, being designed, conceived, as I said, I find it helpful to see it as an instantiation of the principles of modernity that Beck was talking about, and that relates to member states' practices and institutions which are based on what Beck and others see as the obsolescent practices and institutions of modernity. And another crucial step in the argument here is to see this separation between the principles and the institutions as reflected in the distinction made within the new public management between outcomes and outputs. In new public management, essentially, the politicians create a set of outcomes. They create a set of results that they want to see. And they hand over to the bureaucracy, or whatever we might call them, the mission of producing a set of outputs that will produce those outcomes. I can best do this through an example, and is it an example from New Zealand where the new public management was very, very deeply entrenched. So, within new public management, the Minister of Education had a personal contract with, for instance, the head of the Education Review Office, which is the inspection service. And she had a personal contract with him, and she was personally responsible. He said, the outcomes I want from you are proof that we can be confident that our schools are doing what they're funded to do, broadly. She responded, in the form of the contract, and it is a contract, we will attain those outputs through the following outcomes, through the following outputs. There will be 634 inspections of secondary schools. There will be 519, etc., etc., with a maximum of 5% sustainable complaints, and that's my contract. And that's the relationship between outputs and outcomes. And it's a very interesting relationship, and one of the places where targets got a bad name. For instance, the Minister of Transport had a contract with the New Zealand police, and the minister's outcome was that there would be a reduction in the number of people who were driving under the influence of alcohol. And the Chief of Police said that the outputs that he would produce to ensure this would be that his men would stop and smell 20,000, I don't know, 20,000 people in the course of a year. So they got to day 364 of the year, and the Chief of Police found that he was 5,000 breath tests short. So he had to do 5,000 breath tests in a day. So what he did was find the busiest road in the country, which is the Auckland Harbour Bridge. As you can imagine, it's a choke point. And the police stopped everybody crossing the Auckland Harbour Bridge on a Friday afternoon until they'd done 5,000, and then they cleared off. And he delivered his outputs. Right. So, in this case, I'm not saying that the relationship's the same. In this case, I think that the European modernization project can be seen as constructing a set of desirable outcomes. That's what the modernization project does. It creates outcomes. And the relationship between, probably as mediated through the OMC, the relationship between the European and the national levels is that what nation states are essentially doing is producing outputs. And their outputs are to be directed towards the achievement of this outcome of modernization. So the status of European outcomes is as targets for national education outputs. What this means, and this is a list which is intended, I'm not going to defend every element of this list, and please do attack it, because okay. What it means is a shift from lingering Fordist institutions and practices, but it also requires shifts from a focus on qualifications in the form of human capital to competences for knowledge economy and lifelong learning, which I abbreviate to NEL. Does anybody know what a NEL is in English?
I should not.
A knell is the bell they ring at funerals. And there's a famous line.
In Slovenian language, nauček.
There's a line from Macbeth in Shakespeare where he says, I think it's Macbeth says it, "Hear it not," the bell rings off stage. "Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell." And it seems to me a quite appropriate term to use here. So we've got that. Competencies for knowledge, economy and lifelong learning. We go from the very, I've always thought of school effectiveness as a very Fordist kind of thing. And we move from school effectiveness to much more kind of post-Fordist quality measures. Again, Fordist school management to distributed leadership. I think a key one is the centrality of the curriculum to the centrality of pedagogy. The way under modern school systems, previous modern school systems, that they were changed was to change the content. If we wanted to change those three elements of the social contract, making better people, etc., etc., the way we did it was by changing the curriculum. That's how we do it. Now we don't do that so much. What we do is change the centrality and indeed, I think, the scope of pedagogy. We move from, and this is hierarchy, to networks and stakeholders, and I don't like very much the terms networks and stakeholders, so don't pin me on those. We move from the idea of the grammar of schooling with the centrality of the curriculum to what Basil Bernstein called the totally pedagogized society. Everything is pedagogized. We can see it now. Well, just look at the television. You've learned more about how to cook than you ever wanted to know. You've learned more about how to shape your body than you ever needed to know, etc. It's totally pedagogized. We're told how to do everything. We're told how to do walking. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's a shift from government to governance, which we're familiar with. Another one that I think is quite interesting is it's a shift from the idea of moving from school to work transition to a life course transition. It's not much good talking about school to work transition when there isn't any work, and that has been finally registered. It's a move from naming and shaming to competitive comparison. And the nearest full approximation we get to it is to say that schools have to become multi-purpose learning centres, which would fit in with a number of those things. One other thing to be said, to be added to that list, is that, as some kind of evidence, if you like, for it, is that of the 8 key competencies for lifelong learning, which we would assume, historically from the sociology of education, were directed towards improving the level of human capital development, of that 8, only 2 are anything to do with skills development, which we would have expected 10 years ago. So lifelong learning is now no longer just one aspect. This is in 2000. It must become the guiding principle. And at the conference that I was at 2 days ago, the American sociologist Tom Popkowitz was also talking about lifelong learning. And he put it very nicely. He said, lifelong learning is a script, isn't learning anything, it's a script for how to live your life. And I think that's quite nice. 2006 pronouncement emphasized the need to accelerate the pace of reform. Now, lifelong learning is seen as a sine qua non of achieving the Lisbon goals while strengthening the European model. And we want synergy between knowledge policies and all these components of it. And following the midterm review, we get a set of redirected goals for education and training with an integrated action program in the field of lifelong learning as the basis of a new generation of EU education programs. Now, one of the reasons, there is a kind of technical reason for the emphasis on lifelong learning, and that is no member states, in effect, claim that that's part of their education system. So there isn't a problem of subsidiarity. So there's a tactical reason for doing it as well as a political reason. And finally, if we look, we often hear, okay, we know about this education policy stuff. What difference has it made? What effects does it have? Well, okay, we could say. But the literature tends to be limited to finding effects on. And if it can't find and identify a direct effect of a European policy on a domestic policy or practice, it says nothing's happened. That's extremely short-sighted. Effects, for a number of reasons. Effects can be registered in terms of different conception of effect, in terms of the source of the effect, and in terms of the mode of transition. In particular, I think, the notion of effects on limits us to only one of Stephen Lukes's famous 3 dimensions of power. He says there are 3 dimensions of power that increase in their strength and importance. There is the power to effect decisions. Who prevails in decision making? That's the first phase. The second phase is the power to set agendas. That's much more important, he said, because than being able to prevail in an agenda, because you control what you even get to argue about. And the third phase of power goes beyond that. It sets more broadly the rules of the game, and it operates at the level also of preference formation. Now those things, the second and third of those, we can't see. There are no clear effects on those. We can see the results of them. And that's a major way that I think the effects happen. And then this ignores effects at other than the national level. It ignores possible side effects, consequential effects. And the effects can be concealed under conceptions of hybridity, or as I would prefer to say it, because I think this is the most succinct way of conceiving of what I'm talking about, that the relationship between the European and national levels in education is one based on a functional and scalar division of labour. They do different things at different levels, and it's starting from there to look for that I think we need to look for. And finally, they never look for the effects on Europe. It's very interesting to look at. Pavel, you'll know about this. Look at what the Bologna literature is almost exclusively concerned with effects on national education systems. Never concerned with effects. I mean, I'm sure you're very pleased it's not.
Contemporary literature.
Yeah,
not 10,
absolutely.
15 years back.
No effects on Europe. Europe has been transformed by it. And Europe is being transformed by all these things, but we never see the effects of it on Europe. And that's, I think, a huge lacuna. And if I remember rightly, that's the end. Yes. Okay, right. Any questions? Yeah.